of the Alberta Food Matters board and will be moderating our session today. So I will just go over a few quick housekeeping items. I'm sure you've all heard them. But just so you know, we do have a link to every session of the symposium. So you can continue to talk and engage after this session. Myself and some other people will have to leave kind of right on the hour to get to the next one. But if you do want to attend another session, just know you have to exit out of this one to click into a new link. If you could keep your device muted during the session, that would be great. We will be recording the session, so as the recording starts, I believe it already has, just click the continue button. We do have a member of the Edmonton Regional Learning Consortium with us today, so that is Sandra. So if you guys are having any technical problems, please just put them into the chat and Sandra can help you out. And as always, if you have a question throughout the session, you can use the chat box or you can use the raise hand function. So we would like to thank our financial sponsors for this event. We have the O'Brien Institute for Public Health at the University of Calgary, the AA Pediatric Medical Clinic, and our door prize sponsor, which is the Botanical Gardens at the University of Alberta. So now I would like to introduce our session and our speaker today. So our session is the Good Food for Learning Universal Curriculum Integrated School Lunch Program Research. And our speaker is Dr. Rachel Engler-Stringer, who is an associate professor in the Department of Community Health and Epidemiology in the College of Medicine at the University of Saskatchewan. She is also a researcher with the Saskatchewan Population Health and Evaluation Research Unit. She is currently the chair of the Saskatoon Food Council and the principal investigator on a curriculum integrated universal school lunch program intervention study. She has a doctorate in nutrition, and her research interests include community food security, food environments and food access, food system sustainability, health promotion, and community-based and participatory research. We are both in Saskatoon today, and there's supposed to be a big storm, so we are glad she can join us, and I will pass it on to her.
Great, thank you very much. I'm going to assume everyone can hear me. If you can't, let me know. Okay. So yes, I am coming to you today from Saskatoon, which is on Treaty 6 territory and the homeland of the Métis. So I am going to just launch right in. What I had said I was going to present many months ago when I agreed to do this is a little different now because of the pandemic. Our program of research had to shift. We had to put some things on hold. So I'm going to jump around a little bit on a couple of different studies and tell you about the Universal Curriculum Integrated School Lunch Program study, population health intervention study that we are working on as well. But I'm going to tell you about some other things also. So please feel free, if you have clarification questions throughout, to just put your questions in the chat and I can address those throughout the presentation. I'm also going to save time at the end to have time for more questions. But if you have questions for clarification, feel free to stop me throughout the presentation. Okay. Okay. So I wanted to just start by contextualizing kind of where we're at and where the research that I am the leader on, but a very large team conducts, where it fits. So for those of you who don't already know, I imagine that most of you who are here do know this, but that in March 2019, so a year and a half ago now, it seems like forever ago at this point, but in March 2019, the federal government put out as part of their budget, and so you can see in this sort of second paragraph here, so they announced the government's intention to work with provinces and territories towards the creation of a national school food program. And this was an important moment. It was the first time the federal government has talked about a national school food program. And this is particularly important because Canada is the only G7 country without any kind of national school food policy and program. And we're one of the only OECD countries without a national school food program. So Canada is a bit of an outlier on this front. So March 2019 kind of marked the beginning of trying to get us to the point where we have some sort of a national school food program. So I want to talk to you briefly about the history of school food programs around the world, in part because I think it helps us to understand where we are right now. So there was a really interesting review article published in 2016 by Dinger et al. It's a Swedish name. It's a challenging one to pronounce for me. It's a very long, very extensive review article. And what it does is it breaks school food programs into 3 phases. It talks about the first, second, and third phase. The first phase of the establishment of school food programs around the world really, depending on the place, happened between about 1850 and the 1970s. And at this point, the school food programs were primarily about reducing hunger, concerns around hunger and malnutrition in populations, and school food programs were presented by governments as a way to deal with that issue. In particular, it often happened around war. So a war would happen and there would be a discovery that lots of young men going to join the war were malnourished and had various nutrient deficiencies. And so in the aftermath of those wars, that was quite often when school food programs were established. The second phase of school food programs started in the 1970s, especially in Europe, and then kind of moved into the US and the UK in the 1990s and 2000s. And this was where there was a recognition that the nutritional quality of the food being served was not all that great, and that school food programs needed to focus more on the quality of the food that they were offering. So more focus on nutrition policies, on having school food programs be consistent with dietary guidelines and so on. And then the third phase, which is which is sort of what we're in the early stages of right now, really is, it's varying in different parts of the world, but really is about moving beyond simply food quality, which is also not by any means perfect in many countries, but has come some way, into also beginning to see how school food programs can be integrated into broader social and environmental issues. So things like integrating school meal programs into the curriculum, looking at the school environment in general, school food programs that are attempting to make some sort of environmental sustainability changes, moving more into local food, those sorts of things. So trying to use school lunch programs as a means to also address other issues that have come up in our society. So I want to tell you quickly about an article that we published, a group of us, in 2018 in the Canadian Food Studies Journal. And this was doing a review of international literature on promising practices really in school food programs. So kind of what works in various places in the world, what are the characteristics that appear to be the most promising, and putting those together to create what we thought were the key characteristics of a school food program that of what could become a national school food program for Canada. And so this is the article. This is an open access journal, so any of you can access this easily if you just Google it. And in this article, we came up, I'll show you that in just a second. So I've mentioned a few of these things. Some of what's in the article, things like, we know that the school day diets of Canadian children across the socioeconomic spectrum are poor. So I'd like to explain, there's a number of articles showing this using Canadian Community Health Survey, which is a large national survey, using that data And what has been found is that the daytime diets of Canadian children are poor, and that is regardless of where they sit, where their families sit in the socioeconomic spectrum. So the way I like to sort of interpret this is that we have a universal problem, which is poor school day diets that needs a universal solution. So you'll see where this goes after this. So there's some other, a number of areas looked at in the article, and I've just sort of highlighted a few of them here. The fourth piece, the bottom point on this slide, is makes the case. Really what the literature tells us is that when school food programs are integrated into the classroom, have some integration with curriculum, they are particularly effective and seen positively by children and their families. I've just sort of highlighted here a number of sort of key points from the article. I'm not going to go through these. I'm kind of going to skip straight to what. Yes, and educational outcomes as well or talk a little bit about educational outcomes in that article. Interestingly, from an educational standpoint, in terms of the literature internationally, it appears that attendance, tardiness, are most affected by having school food programs. And there are some studies that show improvements in academic achievement, and as well as that universal programs may reduce education inequalities between higher and lower socioeconomic status children. What we hear quite often, I actually haven't seen this in literature, but what I hear constantly from teachers and principals in my conversations with them is they talk about when school lunch programs are introduced, that there's a decrease in the number of kids who go home and then don't come back to school in the afternoon. So I don't know if that's similar in Alberta, but that's certainly what I hear here in Saskatchewan. Okay, so here are the sort of 6 characteristics that the literature, that from this review of international literature, that we put forward as most critical for a national school food program for Canada. So number 1, that programs are universal, that they are offered to all children in a school, either for free or in a subsidized way. And if it's a situation where it isn't offered for free for all children, that any costs associated, so any fee that children pay, it's done in a way that's non-stigmatizing. So the US system is not like that. So the US system, it's very clear who pays and who doesn't. That is not, there's stigma associated with that and lower participation rates because of that. So that's the first characteristic, is universality, and we can talk more about what that means, what that might look like in different places and so on. Number 2 is that it's health promoting, so that it is consistent with dietary guidelines in this country. So in our case with Canada's Food Guide, and in particular with the most recent 2019 Food Guide. Number 3, that it is respectful. And what we mean by respectful is that local conditions are taken into account. And in fact, local control is quite critical, in that we really have very different communities across this country. And so programs cannot be the same in every part of the country. I mean, I think if I'm using Alberta as an example, what is done in inner city Calgary or inner city Edmonton cannot be the same as what's done in northern communities, for example. Number 4, that it's connected, so that where possible, that programs have community connections in various ways. So things like supporting local producers, engaging families, engaging people in the community in programs. Number 5, that it's multi-component, and that's why in the previous slide I had talked about integration into curriculum. So the idea that you would include aspects of things like food literacy and so on in that would be associated with the program. And number 6, that it's sustainable. And what we mean by this is not necessarily a focus on the environmental sustainability part, although of course that's important. You can kind of see that as a thread throughout all of these, but that it's financially sustainable, and that that there's training provided to people involved in the programs, that they receive a decent wage, and that there's not this sort of constant treadmill of having to apply for grants. I know I hear about that here, certainly in Saskatoon, when I have conversations with people in schools and at the school board level, is the amount of time that goes into applying for small grants that all kind of get pieced together to fund programs in schools. Okay, so now I'm going to kind of shift gears a little bit to an article that we had published earlier this year. And this is a former PhD student of mine who's now faculty at St. Francis Xavier University in Nova Scotia. And what she did for her PhD research was we were able to secure a grant to go into schools, 3 categories of schools in and around Saskatoon, and compare the diet quality of the foods eaten at school of 3 groups. So the 3 groups, so we randomly sampled Saskatoon, City of Saskatoon schools without meal programs, City of Saskatoon schools with meal programs, and rural schools in the surrounding areas of what was the former Saskatoon health region. We now have amalgamated all the health regions, just like you in Alberta. But at that time, at the time we collected the data for this, there were various health regions throughout the province, and the Saskatoon health region basically encompasses communities in Saskatoon and within an hour or so drive of the city. So we went into randomly sampled schools, and we went into classrooms and used some tools to examine what kids were eating at school. So a reminder, those bringing lunches from home, and in two types of schools in particular, and then those who are participating in a lunch program, if there was a lunch program in the school. And what we found was that those students who did participate in meal programs had the highest diet quality scores using the Healthy Eating Index that was adapted for school hours, for the school day. So overall, the diet quality was higher, and this is considering that currently, as lunch programs exist, they're very underfunded. They really do their best with very, very little. And so despite the very minimal resources that are put towards school lunch programs, at this point in time, we still found the highest diet quality in those lunch programs compared to what kids were bringing from home. And again, this is looking at schools in different socioeconomic status neighborhoods. So this is a wide range of I would say a representative sample of children in Saskatoon and in the rural areas surrounding Saskatoon. So in particular, what we found was that there was double the proportion of calories from what we call minimally nutritious foods in those lunches that were brought from home. So minimally nutritious foods are foods that are more sugar, fat, salt than anything else. So that's, we're talking about the granola bars and the juice drinks, the drinks that are sort of those sorts of things that are quite frequent in kids' lunches, and a whole lot of other things. But overall, we found a very high proportion of calories from those minimally nutritious foods you see in the non-meal program kids and the rural schools. So non-meal meal program and rural compared to meal programs. And while we didn't find that the school lunch programs achieved all of the minimum recommendations when it comes to Canada's Food Guide, the previous Canada's Food Guide, because this is done before the most recent one. They didn't meet them all. They came closer, and the overall diet quality, as I said before, was higher. So I'm gonna check my time here. Okay, I'm going to shift gears again. This is a study that another one of my PhD students, Suvadra Gupta, this is one piece of her PhD research. Her PhD is ongoing. We were asked by the Saskatoon Public Schools Division if we would conduct a survey of parents prior to conducting our Universal Curriculum Integrated School Lunch Program study, which I will tell you about in just a moment. They wanted us to do a survey of a representative sample of parents of children in the Saskatoon Public Schools Division, and ask them some questions about what they wanted to see in a school lunch program. And we proposed basically a model, and we asked them how if they would be willing to participate, if they would want their children to participate in it, and also the schools division wanted to know if there was a cost associated for some parents, if they would be willing to pay a proportion of the cost. So we asked a series of questions, and I'm just going to go through some very preliminary results. So this was the very rough analysis that we conducted of the data of caregivers' attitudes towards school food programs. And so this was conducted last November, December. The data was collected last November, December. And right now, actually, Suvadra is in the throes of her more thorough analysis of this data. I didn't tell you, I'm trying to remember how many participants we had. A lot of participants. We had excellent representation from across. So this was a random sample. I should tell you that. It was a random sample of schools in low, mid, and high socioeconomic status neighborhoods throughout Saskatoon. And so what we found, I'll tell you a little bit. So demographic characteristics. So a slight underrepresentation of Indigenous parents, but not by a great deal, and then otherwise relatively close to the population of the city of Saskatoon. A slight overrepresentation of people who identified as white or Caucasian, but fairly close to Saskatoon's population. So we found a slight overrepresentation of people with college or university degrees, but again, not very far off from the population of Saskatoon as a whole. And so this is where I think this is what people are most interested in, and this is really what I wanted to share with you, is that when we put forward a model, so we said, if there was a universal lunch program in your child's school, so all kids had the ability to participate in this program, it was consistent with Canada's Food Guide, and it was offered every day, and so we actually also mentioned and if it was integrated into the curriculum, so kids were involved in preparing some of the food from time to time, that there might be a school garden and school composts, those sorts of things that could also be used to learn about food and the food system, and that would connect back in, so the food would go into the lunch program. Would you want your child to participate? The vast majority of parents said yes. So it was over 90% of parents said yes, they would want their child to participate. And then what we asked is, if this program wasn't free, if you had to pay a portion of the cost, we said, would you be willing to do that? And so we started with the amount of $4 per day per child. And actually the way that we explained it was per day, per month, per year, so that it was clear to parents how much they would actually be contributing. So we said, if you had to pay $4 per day, would you be willing to contribute that much? And we had close to 2/3 of parents who said yes, they would be willing to pay $4 per day. And the reason we chose this number is that based upon our estimates of what it would cost to scale up lunch programs to all schools and to all children in all elementary schools in Saskatoon, that it would probably cost around $4 per day. It might be slightly higher if we factor in infrastructure costs, but it would be somewhere in the range of $4 per day. So just under 2/3 of parents said they would be willing to pay that much. For those who said yes, we then asked them if they would be willing to pay double that. And we're just trying to get a sense of how much was an appropriate amount. And so of those parents, 20% said they'd be willing to pay as much as $8 per day. And those who said no to $4 per day, then we went down to $2 per day. And that was their follow-up question. And of the 36% of parents who said they wouldn't be able to pay $4 per day, they said 20% of them said they'd be willing to pay $2 per day. So really what we were trying to get at, and our purpose in creating this kind of series of questions, was what would families be able to afford? And in part, the school division, would like to see a lunch program that was scaled up to all elementary schools at minimum in Saskatoon. And they wanted to know how much money would need to come from from sources other than parents in order to make a program sustainable. And so we were trying to be able to provide them with some of that data. Okay, so that's another study. And then I've got one more study to quickly talk to you about. And this was a pivot. So in end of January of 2020, so right before the pandemic hit, we finally, after much work, much effort, and several attempts, we received funding from the Canadian Institutes for Health Research to do a universal curriculum integrated school lunch program pilot in 2 intervention schools, and then compare them to 2 control schools. So we received that funding in January of this year, then the pandemic hit. We were supposed to collect our baseline data in May and June of this year. And as everyone knows, schools were closed in May and June of this year. So we do not have that baseline data, and therefore we could not start the universal program this fall as originally planned. So while we were waiting for schools to reopen, we were talking to folks from the Coalition for Healthy School Food, and they wanted to know what was happening. What people were hearing was that when schools were closed, there was a great deal of innovation that was happening in school food. So no lunch programs in schools, but there was this pivot that was happening. Many organizations started offering food to families in different ways. And so we were asked, this is Mary McKenna, myself, and Amberly Roots, who's a PhD student at Guelph. We were asked if we could develop a survey that could be administered across the country, an online survey asking about what was happening during school closures. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about that research. So this analysis, we are in the midst of it. We're in the throes of it right now. And actually I was just sent this from one of my PhD students the day before yesterday. So this is the closest. It's not a final analysis, but we're getting close now. But it is a final sample. So you can see the participation across the country. So we did not manage to get anyone from Nunavut or the Yukon to participate, but we did have a few from the Northwest Territories. So an underrepresentation from the North and an underrepresentation from Quebec, but we did get a very large organization in Montreal participate. So even though there's only 3 responses, one of those is from a very large organization. And then we have 2 responses that were Canada-wide. And so this is organizations that fund school food, but nationally, not just in one province or territory. So we got a good number of responses, I think 136, I believe, total. So just to tell you some quickly what programs look like during school closures. So 83% of those who responded said they previously offered a program and they were offering a different program with schools closed, but 17% actually didn't offer a program before and were offering a brand new program. Overall, food boxes were the most common offering. And then there were a whole lot of different offerings. We've actually really struggled to figure out how to represent, to tell you this story, and we're still kind of working on this because there's such a range of offerings. So you see breakfast, lunches, snacks, food boxes, gift cards, and others included things like a family meal once a week. I remember seeing one where it was fruit baskets. I mean, there's a whole lot of different offerings. So these numbers are quite difficult to interpret. So I kind of caution you in, in their interpretation, because there was such a huge range. We had, in some cases, offering 10 food boxes, as few as 10, and then in other cases offering thousands of snacks. And so what we've got here is an average, and of course this is skewed, right? Because there were some that were very, very large. So you can see there's a confidence interval presented as well to try to help you understand sort of some of the range issues. But we are also going to be presenting the median, not just the mean, in future tables, because the median is not skewed by those really large numbers. So you can see the average number of food offerings. So it's a lot. There were enough programs that were offering very large numbers of whether it was breakfast, lunches, snacks, or food boxes. And you can see the average cost here of these food offerings. So just a couple things to highlight. There were various combinations of programs. Quite a few programs offered more than one thing. There's a lot of variation, and I had already mentioned about the other category. So food was sourced from quite a few different places, from what we would expect, like food distributors and grocery stores. There was also donations. There were also food banks. There were restaurants in a few cases, and 22%, and I think this is really quite important, 22% there was some food sourcing directly from farmers. In most cases, there's multiples of these, so it's not just one. The numbers add up to quite a bit more than 100 here, because typically food was sourced from multiple places. There's also quite a range of people of who prepared and distributed the food. So not surprisingly, about close to 2/3 staff from the organization itself, close to half various volunteers, over 1/3 from staff from other organizations, so that kind of organizations that collaborated together, volunteers from other organizations, 10% professional chefs and cooks. And I did hear from conversations sort of with various organizations offering these programs that in some cities there were examples of out of work because of the pandemic, out of work chefs and cooks who were brought in to prepare foods for families. And then staff from schools and school boards. And then of course there's that other category again. Funding came also from various different sources. I'm not going to go through all of these, but you can see how big the other category is. So the funding was kind of cobbled together, I think in many cases, from multiple different sources, both governmental, non-governmental, and the charitable sector. Okay, so that's the end of all my various data from various different studies. And now I'm going to talk to you about what I was supposed to be telling you about our baseline data from in this presentation, but because of the pandemic, we don't have that baseline data. So this project is called Good Food for Learning. As I said before, it's a curriculum integrated universal school lunch program. So as part of this intervention study, We developed curriculum. We worked with a teacher and a group of consulting teachers to develop curriculum for kindergarten to grade 6. On various aspects of food and food systems, but really to try to integrate curriculum into the program. We developed menus from all sorts of organizations across Canada and beyond, so sort of some well-loved menus from various different organizations. So it's a 2-year-long intervention. The way the study will work is that we will collect baseline data before the intervention, before the program starts. We go into the 2 intervention and the 2 control schools and do 2 things. First is a plate weight study. So that is kind of the gold standard when it comes to nutrition research. So actually weighing before and after eating what kids are eating at school. So both, so what kids are bringing to school from home. And then in addition to that, having all the children and all the staff in the school do surveys of knowledge, attitudes, and practices when it comes to food and nutrition. And then that's pre-intervention. And then we conduct the 2-year-long universal lunch program along with the curriculum in those 2 schools. And then we go back and we measure again. We do the plate weight study again and the surveys of knowledge, attitudes, and practices after the intervention has been in place for 2 years, again in the intervention and the control schools. And then we compare the changes between the intervention and the control schools. And at the same time, during the process of running the intervention, we are conducting a case study of the process of implementation, the challenges, all of these sort of what happens, how does this work, how do you change things quite dramatically when it comes to food in these 2 schools. We've already conducted a baseline study, case study of those 2 intervention schools that was done before the pandemic. So this is what we're intending on doing. For those of you who don't know the literature around school food programs, this has never been done before in Canada. There's very little long-term school food research in Canada. Mostly it's evaluations of relatively short time periods. And okay, I'm just about done. I'm just looking at the time here. And very rarely is there very extensive data collection done, and certainly not plate weight studies in the school context. So really what we're trying to do is a very rigorous, well-designed study of comparing intervention and control schools of this curriculum integrated universal school lunch program. So these are the objectives of our study. I'm not going to read them. I'll just leave them up here for a few seconds so you can take a look. So we're looking at things like changes in diet quality, changes in knowledge, attitudes, and practices, and how how curriculum is integrated. What are the challenges with it? What are the challenges with running the program? Where the schools, the intervention schools, one of them is a very old school, one of the older schools in Saskatchewan, what we call castle schools here. So they're on multiple floors, and the kitchen is in the basement. So, and there's no elevators. So there's some complicated logistics in that school. The other school is a newer school built in the 60s. That's all in one story. And so there's some different logistics in that intervention school. So we want to look at how this happens and what are the challenges experienced by people in the schools when you put in place a universal program. So I believe, yeah, so there's a lot of people involved in this research. So I'm the face, but there's a lot of people involved in this research. Yeah, so I think that's it for me. We have about 20 minutes for questions. So hopefully I can answer any of those that you might have and we can have a bit of a conversation. Thank you very much.
That was wonderful. Thank you, Rachel. We have a few questions in the chat box. So the first one was from Scott Hall. I believe it was on the 3rd research study you were showing, but he just asked about the $4 a day. Is that for both breakfast and lunch, or is that for one meal?
That was just for lunch. Yes, that was because that was what the Public Schools Division wanted to know about. In Saskatoon, we do have breakfast programs and we do have snack programs. But the more common sort of standard is the lunch programs, not the breakfast and the snacks.
Okay. And so the next question, they were just talking about how in Alberta they're able to kind of operate less than $2.50 per student per day. So I don't know, is that $4 a day different in Saskatchewan, or are they finding different values kind of across the country?
Yeah, well, I mean, I've seen quite different numbers in different places across the country, and I think that all depends on what is included. So, is it just the food costs? Is it the food costs and the labor costs? Is it the food costs, the labor costs, and all of the infrastructure costs as well? Is it offered in house? Is it off like there's a lot of different factors involved, and our number of $4 per day, we're not very confident that it is the right number, but it was the closest we could come to based upon the estimations that we had. I've seen most commonly. So when you look at Prince Edward Island, and because they were piloting universal lunch programs in PEI, and I've seen examples in other places. I think Newfoundland as well. They're more. I think the more common number is probably $5 a day, so a little bit higher than ours. But you know, this is not an easy one to determine when we're constantly comparing apples and oranges. So we did our best with that number, and that's kind of where we started because that's what we came to.
I was wondering about that $4 a day. Is that strictly food cost that you quoted there? Okay,
That's food and labor,
operational
and
and everything.
yeah,
Okay,
and
that's
maybe a bit of infrastructure as well.
right. Because our food cost, our ingredient cost hovers around 72 cents a day. That's for
Mhm.
breakfast and lunch.
Well, and I think I mean, again, like it's really hard to say, right? I mean, depending on, so what are the models like? Is it in-house preparation? Is it
Yeah.
coming, like, there's just so many
Yeah, there is
variables.
lots of. So,
Yeah.
what kind of models are predominant in Saskatchewan for this? Is it catered food or?
Yeah, I can tell you Saskatoon. So the way that it works in Saskatoon is that we've got sort of three categories of schools. We've got a handful of schools that currently actually have almost universal programs. And so
Mhm.
those are the schools that are in the lowest income neighborhoods, that have the highest proportion of families that are living in poverty. And so those schools typically feed 80 to 100% of kids.
Mhm.
And that's a handful, like really no more than half a dozen schools. I can't remember the exact number, but it's a small number of schools.
Mhm.
Then we've got 8 schools that feed somewhere where there's a lunch program. There may also be a snack program. There may also be a breakfast program that feeds somewhere between a quarter and about 40% of kids. And so they also have in-house kitchens. So those first two categories both have kitchens in the schools. They're not great kitchens necessarily, but they're, decent enough that they can prepare that much food.
Mhm.
And then the third category is all the other schools, which is, more than 2/3, probably 3/4 of schools. And in those schools, there's either nothing at all, or they get dropped off. There's like a central kitchen where they prepare like sandwiches and like a basic bag lunch, and there's about somewhere between 5 and 15 of those dropped off in those schools. And so those are schools where there might just be a handful of kids who aren't bringing lunch to school each day. So that's the way it looks in Saskatoon. I'm not sure I can tell you about the province as a whole, but that's what Saskatoon looks like.
One other point, is Giorgio still in the schools?
Oh, yeah, that's high schools. Oh,
Yeah,
yes, you know
I
about
know Giorgio very well. Yeah.
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 Yeah, in the high
Calls
schools.
me, he calls me his little rocker. I used to play guitar at Bedford Road, and we did.
Yes, Bedford is just down the street from me. That's where in my
Yeah.
neighborhood. Yeah. So, So what Giorgio's is a caterer who goes
Yeah.
into some of the schools, some of the high
Mhm.
schools in
Yeah.
Saskatoon,
He's an
and
Aiden
offers,
Bowman. And,
yeah, yeah,
yeah.
and offers things like pizza and chicken fingers
Yeah.
and Caesar salad and some fruit and
So
those.
is it in the high schools, are there school food programs operating in conjunction with Giorgio?
I think they're not in those schools. I don't know that there are lunch programs, although I actually am not that familiar with the high schools.
Okay, so this is
Um,
strictly elementary is what you're talking about.
yes, I'm talking only about elementary schools.
Yeah, that's a whole other problem. I can see why
Yeah.
there's no infrastructure, there's no real help from the students. There's a little bit, but it's not effective.
And that's
Yeah,
why
good.
that's really important. Actually, you're making a really, really important point, is to separate out the elementary schools and high schools, because they're totally different beasts.
Yeah, that's why when in our model we have. Sorry, I just want to plug our program, but all of our high school students in a typical school year, not COVID, this is an anomaly.
Yeah.
And this is not the norm, and it's not the new normal. This is just an anomaly. But in a normal operational year, the high school students make all the food, and then we deliver it like to the elementary schools, and it just makes perfect sense because those high school students are working in kitchens and stuff anyway. Like they can just work in the school and earn credits and work on their apprenticeship, and it just makes sense. And then we just deliver to the elementary school. Elementary schools don't have the infrastructure to make this stuff, right, and make it work. Right? You need a heck of a lot of teacher, EA support, parental support. And in most communities that need the food, that support isn't there, right? So students are the best resource for the food preparation, I think. But anyway, that's my
yes. Well, no, thank you. And that's it. You know, it's interesting you say that because I often tell the story of my daughter. My kids go to the Francophone school division, and so there's only 2 schools, one elementary, one high school, and my oldest is in the high school now, and in the high school, what they do is they do almost exactly that. So they have this beautiful industrial kitchen, and instead of home economics class, as I took it back in the late 80s, early 90s, it is, they go into the industrial kitchen and they make lunch for the whole school 1 day a week. Every grade does it 1 day a week. And then the kids pay, so it is paid, it's not free for everyone. But you know, your kid gets to prepare the food 1 day a week and eat the food every other day, well, including that day of the week. So it's a way of doing a much more, the home economics curriculum is to be desired in Saskatchewan. It's still, you know, making Rice Krispie squares and various things that, you know, might be lovely, but really are not all that practical in the long term. So it's a way of really revamping the home economics curriculum, so kids learn to actually prepare real food at school, and then they feed all their classmates, which I know my daughter absolutely adored doing. But of course, this is not a normal year, so that program does not exist right now. Oh, I see Wanda wanting to ask a question.
Well, I'm just wondering, with your research, so I'm going to go back to that. Do the governments come to you? Like, did the federal government express an interest in knowing what you found out? Did the Saskatchewan? I'm just thinking it's the governments and their policy that we've got to affect. And I just wonder, are they even casting about for good information?
You know, it's a good question. I'm not sure I can answer it. We've certainly offered it to them. We have offered it. We have offered to the federal government. We haven't done an extensive amount of sort of advocacy and sharing our results with the provincial government at this point yet. We wanted to get to a certain point before we started doing that. We wanted to make sure we had enough data published that we could comfortably go to them. And we're kind of just reaching that point right now. So I think that's kind of in the works over the next year or so. You know, it's really too bad that we're not already partway through this intervention study. And that's only due to COVID, because we'd also like to be able to share some of that data with them when we go and share the rest of our data. But yes, we have made efforts to try to share it, and we haven't had uptake at this point in time. But we also will be doing some more, a more concerted effort to do that now that we have more of our data actually published.
Awesome. Rachel, we have some questions here from Matthew. So what are your thoughts about the reservations that many organizations and governments seem to have about providing families with gift cards and money instead of food? Then he says, when the pandemic hit, many proponents believe that families could be empowered to provide their basic needs, while many critics of this approach seem to think families will be irresponsible with the money. Many families and government refuse to allow gift cards to be provided. What is the more effective way, providing families with food hampers or gift cards?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure I can tell you what I think is the more effective way. I can tell you that, I mean, overall, you know, if you look at, if what we're talking about is dealing with poverty, it's an income issue, not a food issue. And so, you know, that means that interventions should be focused on not on food, but should be focused on income. But this is a complicated, so school food programs are a bit of a complicated beast in the sense that, what I said way back at the beginning, that the problem is a universal problem. It's not, and a universal problem needs a universal solution, in the sense that if you look at what kids are eating during the day, it doesn't matter whether they come from low-income families or high-income families, they're not eating very well during the day. And that is more of a function of our lives, a function of the huge overabundance of unhealthy foods in our food environment. I'm a parent of 2 young kids. I know how busy we all are, and there are so many convenience packaged foods at the grocery store that we can just grab and toss into a lunch kit when that's what our options are. And so this is what happens, and this is what families have. So it's a bit of a long answer, but what I think part of this is about unpacking what we're talking about in terms of problems. We're talking about the pandemic in particular. There were families that relied upon those meal programs, breakfast, snacks, lunches at school to feed those kids. And those primarily are low income families. I'm not sure I can say whether I think that gift cards or food or Hampers or whatever are sort of the best. I tell you that what is most expensive, what families struggle with the most, are vegetables and fruit. So I think that's part of why a lot of programs ended up being vegetable and fruit baskets, or good food boxes, basically, that were primarily vegetables and fruit. So I'm not sure about what's best and what's not best. I think everyone was doing the very best with what they had in a very complicated situation that they're trying to deal with then and there. But I know it's vegetables and fruit that tend to be what gets left behind when you're struggling financially.
Can I add
Awesome.
something?
Oh, sorry, Scott, go ahead.
I've been in the hamper business since March, and Clifford Gladue is in the business with me up north. And the whole idea behind the hampers from the nations that we worked for were to keep people at home. Yeah. So gift cards would have defeated the purpose, right? Because they give them a gift card and they go into Walmart and go all over town, come back to the reserve, and that was the whole point, was to keep people at home. And so we started running logistics for 4 nations and 2,000 homes and 13,000 people, and we were able to get it down to about $50 a hamper for that was a 2-week hamper, and that included produce, a big box of produce and dry goods, and then frozen meat. And then the nations added all of their cleaning supplies and stuff, because toilet paper was an issue in the beginning. Yeah, and so it was effectively, at the time for COVID anyways, the food hampers weren't necessarily for food security or a poverty reduction. It was more like, we want to keep people at home, so we're going to send them what they need. And in particular, the elders, I think we were sending out the elders hampers almost weekly, just to make sure that they were taken care of. And we're continuing with the hampers now, and no end in sight. So yeah, if you have any hamper questions, I'll be talking tomorrow morning. But yeah.
Thank you.
Wonderful. Rachel, there's another question from Matthew. So he said, if school closures happen again, what recommendations would you make, if any, for schools, governments, organizations looking to support families at home with food?
I'm not sure. I don't even want to answer that question, because it's there's a part of me that's like, please, let's not have to deal with that. But we may have to. Yeah, I think that that the argument that good food boxes or food boxes of various sorts are what keep people at home and not having to leave their house. There is a good argument for that. I think there's a reason why that became the most common response. If you saw, that was 70%, right, were food boxes of various sorts. So I think if your purpose is to ensure people have what they need while they're at home, then it's delivery of those boxes. Yeah, I mean, this is I kind of feel like at this point in time, we don't know what the right answer for so many things, what the right answer is. But I tend to trust communities in that if what they determine, if 70% move towards food boxes, that's probably for a good reason, that was what was most practical and made the most sense in that context. And so likely will be the same again going forward. Where are we at for time?
Awesome. We have a couple more, we have maybe just a couple more minutes if anybody has any more questions. Feel free to, you can ask them.
Is your hand raised from before, or did you just leave it up?
I just put it up. What I remember from Scott's, we went to his school, and one of the things that he said that stuck with me was they changed the culture of the children's eating, because if children are used to, for this last generation, packaged foods, that's a culture. That's what they associate with good food. And to my mind, a universal healthy school food program would reroute them to a better culture of eating. That's my opinion.
Yeah, we, myself and Sarah Kirk from Dalhousie and Ian Mosby from Ryerson University just we just wrote a book chapter in the new Canadian Food Studies sort of textbook that makes exactly that argument. So you and I agree on that front, that a national school food program is consistent with Canada's food guide has the potential to be what takes us from a food guide that is total. At this point, our new food guide is aspirational, right? It's not something that exists in reality. No, people don't eat that way for the vast majority of people in this country. But if we want to take it from being aspirational to being a reality, one of the best ways we could do that would be through a national school lunch program that, as you have all described. Yeah, so making kind of that same argument.
So what is that? What's the title of that book?
Well, it's not out yet. So I think it's called, is it called Canadian Food Studies? Yeah, I think that's what it's called. It's an Oxford University Press textbook, basically. It's a university textbook. And they've had two editions before. This is the third edition. We added a chapter in this edition on school food and making that argument. I will let you know when it is published. It's actually a really great book, even though it's meant as an undergrad textbook. It covers such a wide range of food and food systems topics in Canada. It's really quite a useful book.
And Rachel, we just have one more quick question just in these last couple minutes. So from Yun Lee, she says, I also wonder what the impact of food boxes are for new Canadians, especially when it comes to cultural and traditional foods compared to grocery gift cards. So that's a really good point.
Yeah, it is a good point. And I think, I would almost circle that back. I think that is a challenge. And I would almost circle that back to what we talked about, or what I talked about in those characteristics of a national program for Canada, this idea of local control, and that the people in that community need to have their foods and their food cultures reflected in the foods that they're eating in that program. And that's why, what is offered in, I think about a city like Saskatoon, what is offered in our inner city and different parts of our inner city would be different from what would be offered, say, in various parts of rural Saskatchewan or various parts of northern Saskatchewan. The importance of people seeing their food cultures reflected in the foods that are offered in their programs is really critical. And so that means when we're talking about, actually, interestingly, the two schools that are intervention schools in our program, one is in a high newcomer population school, but also with a fair number of Indigenous students. And the other one is in a school that's got a very large Indigenous population. And so there'll be slight differences in terms of the foods that are offered. There will be more traditional foods offered in the school that has a large number of Indigenous kids and families. And then in the school where there's a larger newcomer population, we'll have to pay a bit more attention to things like halal and, you know, ensuring that the foods reflect the food cultures. That's often challenging because in at least in Saskatchewan, I think probably across the country, newcomer neighborhoods with lots and lots of newcomers, there's such a wide range of food cultures represented. We have to sort of work with parents and families and communities on that.
For sure. Well, thank you so, so much, Rachel. That was amazing. We would just like to remind everybody that right now we're having our strategic planning session for Alberta Food Matters. So if anyone could hop onto that Zoom link and help us out, that would be wonderful. But thank you again, Rachel. And we will have, you guys all have the links to the notes as well. So
thanks, everyone. Bye.